I have kept a work log for 11 years. It started as a professional discipline, a records coordinator's habit, nothing more. Every evening before I closed the station, I wrote down what had happened that day. Not for anyone else. Not for the record archive, which had its own systems and its own forms. Just for me. A daily accounting of what I had seen and done and noticed. My third supervisor, Dav Sorn, had told me on my first posting that the difference between a records coordinator who aged well in the work and one who burned out in 6 years was a private log. Not an official one, a personal one, a place to put the things that didn't fit a form. I wrote about intake anomalies. I wrote about difficult cases I hadn't solved yet, working through them in prose the way some people work through arithmetic. I wrote about the weather on the ridge outside the station window. I wrote about the canteen's rotating menu and which options were worth the wait. After 11 years, I had 32 completed volumes and was a third of the way through the 33rd. The handwriting in the early volumes was neater. I had been trying to impress someone, I suppose, even though there was no one to impress. By volume 12, I had given up the performance and just wrote the way I thought, which was faster and more honest. I did not think of it as a diary. Diaries were for people with interior lives that required excavation. My log was practical, observational. The record a person keeps when they have decided that paying attention carefully is the most useful thing they can do with the hours they have. I mention all of this because it matters. The kind of document it was matters. What I wrote in it, and why, and the fact that I never intended for any of it to be read, that matters more than I can say. They arrived on a Tuesday in the 3rd month of the year, the Queen and her daughter, with 2 Velthorin house staff and a compact diplomatic liaison officer who looked like he had not slept properly in a week. Sovereignty instrument reviews at our station were not common. We were a mid-tier transit and records posting, not a processing hub. But the instrument in question had been filed at Keth Saruval 4 years prior, which gave us jurisdictional standing to host the review, and the regional coordinator had signed the residential authorization 3 weeks earlier. I had prepared the wing myself. 4 rooms, a shared common area, access to the station canteen, access to the transit corridor. Standard protected residency protocol. The diplomatic liaison briefed me in my office while the Queen and her household settled. His name was Dav Sale. He was efficient and precise, and I respected him for not softening what he was telling me. The Sovereignty Instrument Review had been triggered by a technical challenge from a competing house. The challenge was formally valid, which meant the Queen could not exercise sovereign transit rights until the review concluded. The review had been in progress for 8 months before their arrival at my station. There was no timeline for resolution. The review committee met quarterly. The next scheduled session was 11 weeks away. The session after that was 6 months beyond that. I wrote all of this down in the standard intake forms. Then that evening I wrote about it in my log, in the section I kept for cases that were bothering me even when I couldn't yet identify why. I wrote, the diplomatic liaison briefed me today on the instrument status. 8 months into review with no conclusion date. They have given her a residential wing and a transit pass, and the complete procedural courtesy of a sovereign under review. What they have not given her is a date. I have been a records coordinator for 11 years, and I know what indeterminate suspension does to a person over a long enough stretch. I am going to read the full instrument file tomorrow. I read the full instrument file the next day. It was 231 pages. I took notes in the log because that was how I processed dense material. By page 90, I had found 3 procedural pathways that had not been used. By page 140, I had identified a cross-reference between the challenge documentation and a review committee procedural update from 6 years ago that the opposing house had not cited. By page 200, I had drafted, in the margin of the log, the outline of a motion for expedited review on the grounds of the procedural gap. I was a records coordinator, not a legal officer. Filing a motion was outside my authority. Getting the right document to the right person who had the authority to file it, that was something I could do. I spent 3 weeks building the case file. I did not mention it to the Queen. It was not something I had accomplished yet, and I did not tell people about things I had not yet accomplished. What I did during those 3 weeks and the weeks that followed was work, and Ale came to the records room. She appeared on the 4th day of the residency, at the 2nd hour of the afternoon. She stood in the doorway for a moment. I had read enough about Velthoran children to know that standing in doorways was assessment rather than hesitation, and then she came in and sat in the chair across from my desk. She was small. She had copper-amber eyes that were very large in the proportion of her face, and white-silver hair that her mother kept braided close. She was wearing a transit-stay coverall that had been carefully altered to fit her. She looked at the shelves of archive volumes for a long time without speaking. Then she said, in careful compact standard, "How many of those have you read?" "All of them," I said. "They're organized by year and subject. The ones on the left are transit records going back 40 years. The ones on the right are instrument filings." She considered this. "Are they interesting?" "Some of them are. The transit records from the early years are interesting because the station wasn't classified correctly for the first decade of operation, which created a series of jurisdictional anomalies that took 20 years to fully resolve." She looked at me. "What happened to the people who were processed incorrectly?" "Most of them were reclassified retroactively. A few cases required individual review. I've been working through the backlog. There are 11 cases still open from those years." "Are you going to close them?" "That's my intention." She sat for another few minutes, looking at the shelves. Then she said, "I'll come back tomorrow if that's acceptable." "It's acceptable," I said. She came back the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the 2nd week she had her own chair. She had simply begun arriving at the same chair every afternoon, and I had stopped thinking of it as the visitor's chair and started thinking of it as Ale's chair. She brought a small notebook from the 3rd week on, and she wrote things in it in a close, careful script that I did not try to read. When she had a question, she asked it, and I answered it, and she wrote the answer down. The questions were systematic and forward-building, each one following from the last with the logic of someone who was constructing a complete picture rather than collecting interesting facts. She did not fill silence with unnecessary speech. She did not ask questions she could resolve herself. When she arrived, she sat down and opened her notebook and began where she had left off the previous day, which meant she held her place overnight with the same exactness she held it on the page. Some days the only words exchanged between us were the questions and the answers and the occasional note she passed across the desk. A found discrepancy, a date she could not read, a notation in an older hand that she wanted confirmed. On those days, I felt the particular comfort of working alongside someone who understood that useful silence was not absence. By the end of the 1st month, she had worked through all 40 years of transit records. She had moved on to the instrument filings. I wrote about her in the log every evening, not extensively at first. A few lines, what she had asked, what I had observed. The way her writing posture changed when she found something interesting. She leaned forward slightly and her pen slowed down, which was the opposite of what most people did. The fact that she never asked me to explain something she could look up herself, so the questions she did ask were always the ones that genuinely required another person. The fact that on the days when the diplomatic communications had been difficult, she arrived a few minutes later than usual and her first question was always a technical one rather than an exploratory one, as if she needed to begin with solid ground before she could work outward. By the end of the 1st month, she had a system. She read in sequence, volume by volume, making notes in the notebook as she went. When she finished a volume, she returned it to the exact position on the shelf and took the next one, and she held each volume with a careful 2-handed grip that suggested someone had told her early that documents were worth handling correctly. Some afternoons she asked no questions at all and simply read and wrote notes, and I worked across from her, and we were two people occupying the same room, each doing their own work, which was a companionable thing that I did not name while it was happening. On one afternoon in the second week, she looked up from the volume she was reading and said, "The classification error from year 12 persists in the records through year 22. Someone kept reusing the original wrong code." "Yes," I said. "It compounded across a decade before anyone caught it." "How did they catch it?" "A new coordinator did a full audit of the period 11 files and found an inconsistency in a single entry. She followed it forward." Ale considered this. What happened to the coordinator who made the original error? She had been retired for 6 years by the time it was found. So she never knew. "No." Ale was quiet for a moment. "That seems like something you'd want to know," she said, "even after." "I think you're right," I said. She went back to reading. I wrote the exchange in the log that evening, and then I wrote, "I think she means that errors matter beyond their consequences. That knowing what you got wrong is part of the record even if no correction is possible. This is a position I agree with entirely, and I am not used to a 7-year-old being the person to articulate it to me." I also wrote about the Queen. I saw the Queen less often than I saw Ale. She came to my office twice in the first month on administrative matters, once to discuss the transit pass parameters, once to sign a documentation update for the residency record. She was correct and precise, and I could not tell from either meeting how the suspension was weighing on her. She was very good at being correct and precise. It was not a wall exactly. More like a professional surface, the kind you develop when you have spent a long time in situations where showing what you are actually experiencing would be an inconvenience to others. What I observed, because I paid attention to things, was what the surface cost her. She walked the transit corridor every morning at the 6th hour. I was usually at my desk by then, and the corridor was visible from the records room window. She walked at a measured pace with her hands clasped behind her. She always stopped at the same point on the north end of the corridor where the window gave a long view of the ridge. She stood there for exactly 5 minutes. I counted a few times before I stopped counting, because counting felt intrusive, and then she turned and walked back. On days when Ale had come to breakfast before the walk, the Queen's pace on the return was slightly faster. On days when the diplomatic communications had gone badly, the stop at the window ran to 6 minutes or 7. I wrote about this in the log, not as analysis, just as what I saw. I wrote, "She is managing something that has no resolution date. I have been watching her manage it for 6 weeks, and I have not seen her manage it badly. That is not nothing. In my experience, sustained indeterminate suspension is one of the harder things to carry with dignity. She carries it with dignity. I haven't found the right word for the specific quality of how she does it. The word that keeps almost fitting and then not quite fitting is endurance, but endurance implies effort, and what I observe doesn't look like effort in the usual sense. It looks like something structural. Load-bearing, maybe. I'll think about it." I kept thinking about it across the second month. I kept watching through the window. I kept writing. In the second month, the Queen began appearing in the records room doorway on her corridor walk. Not entering, just pausing. The first time I thought it was accidental. She was at the point in the corridor where the doorway was visible, and she glanced in, and I happened to be looking up, and we acknowledged each other with the standard professional nod, and she continued her walk. The second time I understood it was deliberate. She was checking that Ale was there. On the days Ale arrived early, the Queen's corridor walk ended a few minutes before the usual time, and the doorway pause didn't happen. On the days Ale arrived late, the pause was a little longer, and the Queen's gaze went to Ale's chair before it went to me. I wrote, "She checks on Ale through the records room doorway on her morning walk. She does not come in. She does not interrupt. She checks that the chair is occupied and then she continues her walk. On the days Aile's chair is empty when she passes, she looks at me instead, and I have begun giving a small nod to indicate that Aile is expected but has not yet arrived. She accepts this. We have developed a system neither of us has discussed. I also wrote, a few entries later when I had been thinking about it more. The system works because she trusts me to give her accurate information about Aile's whereabouts without requiring an explanation of why she needs it. I don't know when I earned that trust. I don't know if she is aware she has extended it. But she has, and I am treating it with the same care I give the instrument file, not casually, not performatively, just correctly. There were 2 occasions in the second month when she came to the records room threshold herself, in the afternoon, outside the corridor walk. Both times she was looking for Aile on something specific, a canteen question, a schedule matter. Both times she delivered the message and left. Both times Aile remained at her chair, answered the message, and went back to reading. The interactions were brief and correct, and I was present for them at my desk, and I wrote about them both, trying to be precise about what I was observing, which was that the Queen conducted herself in the records room with the same composed exactness she brought to administrative meetings, but that in the specific proximity of the afternoon light, when she was not in formal house attire and was simply looking for her daughter. The precision had a quality of weight underneath it that the administrative meetings did not have. I was trying to find the word for this when the 3rd week arrived. The 3rd week of the second month, I sent the expedited review outline to Dov Sale. He read it in 4 hours and forwarded it to the regional legal coordinator with a recommendation to file. He called me afterward. He said the legal coordinator had described the procedural gap as significant. He said this carefully, the way a careful man says things he is not yet allowed to call good news. I did not tell the Queen. I wrote in the log that evening, the outline is with the legal coordinator. Dov Sale says the gap is significant. I have not told the Queen because I do not want to give her another outcome to wait on when I don't yet know what the outcome will be. She is already waiting on enough. 3 weeks later Aile stopped in the middle of reading volume 11 of the instrument filings and said without preamble, "There are 11 open cases from the early misclassification period. You mentioned them on the first day." "Yes. I found them in the records. I've been reading them. 3 of them have clear resolution pathways that are not being pursued." I looked up which 3. She told me. She was right about 2 of the 3. I had identified those pathways myself in my first month and was building the case documentation. The 3rd pathway she had found was one I had not seen. It was a cross-reference between a compact administrative amendment from 9 years ago and the original misclassification code, and it was clean and unambiguous, and I had missed it. I had read those pages. I had not seen what she saw. I looked at my desk for a moment. "The 3rd one," I said. "Which volume and page?" She told me. I pulled the volume and turned to the page, and she was right. "That's the key citation for Case 7, I said. "That's the one I've been missing." I thought it might be. She made a note in her notebook. "I wasn't sure it was actually useful before I told you." I wrote that evening for a long time. I wrote, "Aile found the citation for Case 7 that I missed. I have been a records coordinator for 11 years. She has been reading transit archives for 3 months. She is 7 years old. I am going to submit the Case 7 resolution motion with her cross-reference as the primary supporting document. I am going to cite the volume and page, and I am going to put her name in the filing as the source of the identification. This is accurate, and accuracy is the standard." I asked her the next day if she objected to being cited in a formal resolution motion. She considered it with the expression she used when a question required more than a direct answer. "Will it be accurate?" she asked. "Completely accurate." "Then no," she said, "I don't object." She went back to her reading. I spent the remainder of that afternoon on the Case 7 motion. Ale worked alongside me in companionable quiet, reaching for the next volume in her sequence, pen moving steadily. She had a way of working that was self-contained without being closed. She would occasionally look up at the shelves with the considering expression she used for cross-reference problems, trace some connection in her notebook, and return to the volume. She never interrupted me when I was working through something difficult, which meant she had learned to read when I was working through something difficult, which required a kind of attention I found I was grateful for. When she left at the end of the session, she picked up her bag and paused at the door, which was not something she usually did. "You're good at this," she said, "finding the thing inside the thing." Then she left. I wrote that evening. Ale said I was good at finding the thing inside the thing. I have been thinking about what she meant by that. I think she means that reading a document completely, past the summary to the pages that most people skip, is a kind of finding. The thing inside the thing is what is there when you don't stop at what appears to be there. That is the work. That is, I think, what the work has always been, and I have been doing it long enough that I forget it is not what everyone does. I have been doing it for 4 months with the instrument file, and I have been doing it, I realize, looking back at the entries since the residency began with everything else in this station, with the ward reports, with the transit logs, with the corridor outside my window in the early morning, and the 5-minute stop, and the slight lean of someone looking toward something distant. I wrote, I think I have been doing it with her too, reading past the surface. And the thing inside the thing is that she is very tired and very determined and has been doing this entirely alone, and I am apparently the only person in this station who has noticed both facts at the same time. The 3rd month began. The regional legal coordinator filed the expedited review motion on a Thursday morning. I received the notification at my desk and held it for a moment, reading it twice, before filing it in the instrument case folder. I did not tell the Queen. The response window was open for 2 weeks. There was nothing yet to tell that would be useful. What I did was go to the canteen that afternoon and bring back 2 cups of tea, and set one at Ale's chair. She was already there, reading volume 6 of the instrument filings, which she had returned to after finishing the later volumes. She looked at the tea. She looked at me. "Thank you," she said. "The motion is filed," I said. "The expedited review motion. It's in the instrument file now." She put her pen down on the open page with the precise placement she used when she intended to return to exactly this sentence. "Does my mother know?" "Not yet." She was quiet. "She doesn't like waiting for outcomes," she said, "but she's very good at it." She picked up the tea. "How long?" 2 weeks for the response. Then the committee reviews. Best case, the session is advanced by 3 months. Worst case, the motion is rejected and we continue as we are. What do you think will happen? I looked at my desk. I thought about what I actually believed, as opposed to what I could professionally support. I think the procedural gap is real and the motion is well constructed. I think there is a good chance the session is advanced. She nodded once, the nod that meant this was correct. She went back to her reading. I went back to my work. That evening I wrote in the log for a long time. I wrote about the motion filing. I wrote about Ale's composure and her question, and the way she had placed her pen on the page before she asked it, which seemed to me to say something true about the kind of person she was, keeping her place, preparing to return, treating this conversation and that sentence as both real and not competing with each other. And then I wrote about the Queen, because the day had included something I had not yet recorded. She had been at the window that morning, as she always was. But the storm on the ridge had broken in an unusual way overnight, and the cloud cover had shifted, and the light through the north window had come at a specific angle I had not seen before, horizontal and pale, the kind of early light that made everything look exact. She had been standing in it with her hands clasped behind her and her face turned toward the ridge, and I had looked up from the instrument file at exactly that moment. I wrote what I saw. I wrote it the way I wrote everything, trying to get the exact thing rather than the approximate thing. I wrote about the quality of her composure in that light, which was not hardness and was not performance, but was something I had been failing to name for 4 months. I wrote about what the suspension cost her, and how the cost was visible in the particular way she stood at the window, the slight forward lean of someone looking at something far away that they are also very aware of not being able to reach. I wrote about what it said about her that she paid that cost every morning without anyone seeing it, except me through a records room window. I wrote for a long time, longer than I usually wrote. When I stopped, I read back what I had written, and I saw that it was not an observation in the professional sense, or not only. I had been writing the thing I had been trying not to name since the second week of the residency, which was that I had been watching this woman carry something impossible with perfect composure for 4 months, and that what I felt when I watched her was not professional respect, though it was that too, but something that had grown alongside the professional respect the way a plant grows alongside a wall, using the structure, exceeding it. I did not cross it out. It was accurate. I did not lie in my log. I closed the volume and put it on the shelf with the others. The next morning I picked up the wrong volume on my way out of my quarters. I realized this 3 hours later when I reached for it to write the morning's intake notes and found not a blank page but the entry from the night before. I set the correct volume on the desk and put the wrong one to the side, meaning to return it to my quarters at the end of the day. I did not return it at the end of the day. There was a transit arrival in the late afternoon that went long, and when I finally cleared my desk at the 9th hour, the log volume was still there, closed, on the edge of the desk. I was tired. I turned off the light and locked the records room door and went to my quarters. I did not realize until the next morning that the station cleaning cycle ran between the 9th and 11th hours, and that the cleaning staff held a master key, and that the records room was on the rotation. The door I had locked would have been opened and closed again. The room would have been cleaned. The volume on the desk would have been there, accessible for however long the cleaning took. I stood at my desk at the 6th hour and looked at the log volume, which was in a slightly different position than I had left it. Not the cleaning staff's doing. They were careful and precise and restored things correctly. The difference was small. The kind of difference made by someone picking something up and setting it back down. I stood there for a moment. I picked up the volume and opened it to the last written page. The entry was there. I read it once, standing in the early morning light, the way you read a document when you are trying to understand what the damage is. Then I sat down and made a cup of tea and opened the current volume to a fresh page and wrote the morning's first note, which was a factual account of the transit arrival from the previous evening. I did not know who had read it, if anyone had. I was probably wrong about the position. I was tired and I had put the volume down at the 9th hour after a long transit arrival, and I might have been misremembering where I put it. I was midway through the transit arrival notes when the records room door opened. The Queen stood in the doorway. She was in a gray house garment, not the formal attire she wore to administrative meetings. Her hair was loose, which I had not seen before. She looked like someone who had not slept. Her hands were at her sides, not clasped behind her back, and her expression, which was always correct and contained, was something I did not have a category for, because it was the expression of a person who had set the surface down. She crossed the room and stood at the other side of my desk. She said very quietly, "Are you really in love with me?" The honest answer was yes. I was a records coordinator who had spent 11 years writing down what he observed, and what I had observed across 4 months was that I was in love with her in the specific and inconvenient way that happens when you watch someone conduct themselves with integrity under sustained pressure, and find that you cannot stop noticing it. I had not intended this. I had not been looking for it. It had simply been the accurate conclusion that the evidence produced, arrived at by the same method I used for instrument cross-references and misclassification case files. I said, I wrote what I observed. I don't alter observations to make them more convenient. She looked at me for a moment. Her eyes were the same copper amber as Ailes, darker with age or with whatever the last 8 months had been. You wrote about the walk, she said. How many mornings have you been counting? I stopped counting by the 3rd week. It felt intrusive. But you counted. Yes. You wrote about the light. Yes. You wrote, she stopped. You wrote about the cost, that I carry it with dignity and that it costs something. Yes. She was quiet. She sat down in Ailes' chair, which was not something she had done before, and she looked at the row of completed log volumes on the shelf. There were 32 of them, plus the partial current volume on my desk. They were identical in size and binding. There was nothing from the outside to distinguish one year from another. How many of those are about us? She said. The entries from the last 4 months are, some of them. The work ones are about the instrument file. Some of the others are about what I observe here. You didn't tell me you were working the instrument file. I didn't have a result yet. Dov Sale told me. He called me last week after the motion was filed. She looked at me. He said a records coordinator had found a procedural gap in the challenge documentation. He said the gap was on page 90, and that in his experience most people summarize challenge documentation rather than reading past the first 40 pages. I read everything, I said. It's the practice I was taught. He said the motion is well constructed. She paused. He used the word significant. I know. He told me. She was quiet again. Outside the window the ridge was in early light, the sky the pale gray that preceded color on clear mornings. She was looking at the window rather than at me. Why didn't you tell me, she said, about the motion all those weeks? Because I didn't want to give you something else to wait on. You've been waiting for 8 months. I wasn't going to add another anticipated outcome to the list unless it produced a result. She turned from the window and looked at me directly. You wrote that I carry it with dignity, she said. Yes. I don't feel dignified, she said. I feel like I am managing something that is taking longer than my patience is designed for, and that I am going to be managing it for longer still, and that the only reason I don't let that show at the window every morning is because Ale is watching. I know, I said. I wrote that too. She looked at the log volume on my desk for a long moment. Can I read it, she said, the rest of it? If you want to. Not the personal entries, I've read enough of those. Something moved across her face that wasn't the surface. The work ones. I want to understand how you built the case, how you read 231 pages and found what everyone else missed. That's in the instrument file, which you have full access to. The cross-reference on page 90 is flagged in the appendix. The case file Dov Sale forwarded is attached. Ale found the key citation for case 7. That's in volume 30 of the Transit Archive, page 12. I paused. She came to it herself. She was reading in sequence. She was quiet for a long moment. She talks about you, she said finally. Every evening. She talks about records, transit jurisdictions and instrument cross-references and the 11 open misclassification cases. But what she's actually describing, I've been listening to her every evening for 4 months, and what she is describing is someone who answers her questions completely and does not simplify the answers, who treats what she finds as accurate and citable. She paused. She told me about the case 7 motion, that you're going to cite her in it. She found the citation. It would be inaccurate not to. She is 7 years old. That's not a relevant variable for citation accuracy. She looked at me. Something changed in her expression, something small, and I thought it might have been the nearest thing to a smile she had allowed herself in a long time. You wrote that you couldn't find the word, she said, for how I carry it. I haven't found it yet. I've been working through candidates. What are the candidates? I thought about it. It was an unusual question for the 6th hour of a morning with no sleep between us. But she had asked it directly, and I answered direct questions directly. Endurance, I said. But that's not right because it implies visible effort, and what I observe doesn't look like effort in the usual sense. It looks like something structural, load-bearing. The way a wall holds up a ceiling without anyone noticing the wall while the ceiling is fine. Composure is too surface. Grace is too soft. What I mean is something underneath the vocabulary I have available. I stopped. That's not a useful comparison. No, she said, but I understand what you mean. We were quiet. The light was changing, the color beginning to arrive in the sky outside the ridge window. What happens now, she said, if you're in love with me? Nothing changes, I said. My job is the same, the instrument file is the same, Aile's chair is the same. I will keep writing in the log because it is how I think, and some of what I write will be about what I observe here, and what I observe here includes you. That doesn't require you to do anything. And if I wanted to require something? I looked at her. Then I'd want to know what you actually want, I said. Not what the situation permits or what protocol suggests. What you want. That's a different question. She looked at me for a long time. Her expression was doing something I had not seen before, which was that it was not managed at all. It was the face of a person thinking through something real in real time. I have been in this station for 4 months, she said, in a transit hold residency. I walk the corridor every morning because staying still makes the waiting worse. I stand at the window because the ridge is there, and the ridge is not the station, and looking at it is a way of remembering that there is a world outside the review process. She paused. I did not know anyone was watching. I wasn't watching for evidence, I said. It was just what was visible from my desk. I know, she said. That's what the entry said. She stood. She was going to leave, and I thought the conversation was complete, and then she stopped in the doorway and turned back. My name, she said. Not the formal designation. You didn't write it once in the whole entry. I had noticed this too when I read it back. No, I said. Why? I didn't feel I'd earned it. She looked at me from the doorway. Something passed across her face that was not the surface and was not managed, the expression of a person who has been seen clearly and is recognizing what that feels like. Sarath, she said, my name is Sarath. Then she left. I sat at my desk for a while. I made another cup of tea. I opened the instrument file and read the current motion status, which had not changed. Then I opened the current log volume to a fresh page and began writing the morning's record. Aile arrived at the 2nd hour, as she always did. She settled in her chair. She opened her notebook. Then she looked at me with the direct copper-amber look that she used when she had something to report that required careful delivery. My mother didn't sleep, she said. I know. She was in the common area at the 4th hour. She had a volume, a gray one like yours but with handwriting on the cover. Yes. She wasn't upset when she came back. She wasn't happy either. She was something that didn't have a name. Aile paused. In Velthorin there's a word for when something that was private becomes shared and both things are still true at the same time. I don't know the compact standard equivalent. Neither do I said. She wrote something in her notebook. I did not try to read it. She came to see you this morning, she said. Again, not a question. Yes. Did you tell her about the motion? Yes. Good. She turned a page in her notebook. Did you tell her about the citation, case 7? She already knew. She told me you discussed it. Aile nodded once. I told her it would be accurate, she said. She said she thought so too. She picked up her pen. The response window closes in 9 days. Yes. Are you going to read the response the day it arrives? Yes, all of it. Past the summary. Past the summary. She nodded. She went back to her reading. I went back to the current log volume. I wrote the transit arrival notes from the previous evening. I wrote the motion status. I wrote that I had told the queen her name, which was Sarath, and what she had said when she left, and the quality of her expression in the doorway, which I was going to keep trying to find the right word for. At the end of the afternoon, Ale closed her notebook and packed her things in the usual order. She paused in the doorway on her way out, which she had begun doing more often. She said you wrote that she carries it with dignity, Ale said. Yes. She does, she said. I watch her every morning. She stands at the window for 5 minutes and then she comes back and she has tea with me and goes over my notes from the day before and she's present for all of it, even when she's also carrying the other thing. She adjusted the strap of her bag. I've been writing about that, in my notebooks, not just the records, how she does it, because I'm going to need to know how someday and I want to record it while I can watch it. I looked at her. She taught me the walk, Ale said. 5 minutes at the window, then you come back. She paused in the doorway. She'll do better if someone else knows she's doing it. She's always done better when someone's paying attention to the right things. She looked at me for a moment with something in her expression that was very like the look her mother had given me that morning. You pay attention to the right things. Then she left. I sat at my desk in the evening light. The station settled around me the way it did at this hour, small sounds of the heating system adjusting to the cold coming in from the ridge. The canteen would be serving the last of the day's rotation. The transit corridor would be empty. The ward in the residency wing would be in the common area or in her daughter's room, or perhaps at the window in her own quarters, looking at whatever piece of sky was visible from that side of the building. I held my pen over the open log page for a moment. Then I wrote. I wrote about the morning. I wrote about the conversation, all of it, in the order it had happened because I was a records coordinator and I wrote things in the order they happened. I wrote about the gray house garment and the loose hair and the expression I still did not have a word for. I wrote about her hands at her sides instead of clasped, which was a small thing that was not a small thing. I wrote about the question she had asked, and my answer, and the conversation that followed, and the moment in the doorway. I wrote Sarath, and it was the first time I had written that name in 32 1/3 volumes, and it looked correct on the page in a way I could not have anticipated, and that I did not try to explain. I wrote about what she had said, that she had not known anyone was watching. I sat with that sentence for a while after I wrote it, because it was the sentence that explained the most about the last 4 months. She had been doing all of it without an audience. The morning walk, the 5 minutes at the window, the returning, the evening tea with Ale, the correct and precise demeanor in every administrative meeting, the sustained management of something with no end date in sight. She had been doing it in the specific way you do things when you believe you are doing them alone, with the economy of motion and the internal accounting that replaces external witness. She had not known there was a records coordinator on the other side of a window who read things past the summary and who had been writing it all down. I wrote about Ale's question and her answer, and the 2 sentences she had left me with at the end of the session, which were going to take some time to think through completely. I wrote, she has been taking notes on how her mother carries weight. She came to the records room every afternoon for 3 months, and while I thought she was here for transit archives, she was also here watching a records coordinator pay attention to the right things, because she already knew how to carry what her mother carried and she wanted to understand how to be seen doing it. She was collecting examples. I am apparently one of them. I don't entirely know what to do with that. I think the answer is that I don't have to do anything with it. It is already done. It happened across the last 3 months by accumulation, and accumulation doesn't require a response. It requires recognition. I wrote the motion is filed. The response window closes in 9 days. I am going to read the opposing house's response completely, on the day it arrives past the summary, to whatever page the relevant material is on. That is the practice. That has always been the practice. The practice does not change because the situation has changed. I wrote, I have kept a work log for 11 years. I started it because a supervisor told me it was the difference between someone who aged well in the work and someone who didn't. She was right about that. She did not tell me the whole consequence of it, which is that if you write honestly every day about what you observe, you eventually observe something that changes what you thought you were doing. I thought I was keeping a record. I was. I was also, it turns out, paying attention to a person with the same care I give to instrument files and misclassification cross-references, which is to say the most complete and honest care I know how to give. And that is visible. That is, apparently, its own kind of declaration. I don't have a word yet for what I'm carrying, but I have a name for who I am carrying it about. Her name is Sarath. She stands at the window for 5 minutes and then she comes back. That is the whole of it. That is, in fact, everything.